This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Colleen Coffey, Associate Professor of History and Women's Studies at Ventura College. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here today. And today's topic, just in time for March Women's History Month, is, well, women in history. And we'll be talking about Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. There are relatively few women figures in history, which is dominated by men, so the stories of the few women who were heroes for their work in women's causes are significant in understanding who we are and where we came from. I remember learning about Betsy Ross in grade school, who sewed the first American flag, a really nice story and so acceptable because it portrays a woman doing what women have done for millennia. So Colleen, how does Margaret Sanger's story begin, and why was she so interested in birth control for women?
Well, I think there are three really key things that are important to understand about Sanger to get a sense of her and of her life. The first is that her mother died in her 40s after having been pregnant 18 times.
18? Oh, my gosh.
She had 11 live births and 7 miscarriages.
Oh.
And Margaret is said to have helped birth one of her siblings herself at the tender age of 8 years old.
Oh, my gosh. How traumatic.
So, although the official cause of death was tuberculosis, Margaret never abandoned the idea that her mother had been undone by incessant childbearing.
Well, that's an immune-type disease, a run-down body,
And
isn't it? Yeah.
by contrast, her father lived into his 80s. And so she always had that running in the background of her life's work. The second thing is that she was trained as a nurse. And so her earliest work is on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the tenements, where she sees woman after woman, incessant childbearing, many unwanted children, many women dying from the effects of crude abortions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that obviously makes a big impact on her.
And there was no birth control available.
There was a little bit available, but the information and the devices are suppressed by law, so she cannot talk about them. They're not available for sale. These are the Comstock laws. And then the last thing about Sanger is she kind of cuts her teeth as an activist, as both a socialist and a feminist. So in an early portent of things to come, in 1914, she publishes a feminist monthly called The Woman Rebel, and that's where she coins that term birth control. And in that magazine, the byline of it is "No gods, no masters." So that tells you in 1914, she's already looking at the world in a way that is not common for women at the time.
Right. Who were very much submissive to their husbands or authority figures. So when did she actually found Planned Parenthood? Maybe you could give us a little time frame here. We talked about 1914. She was already thinking along those lines.
Right. So Planned Parenthood starts its life. That Planned Parenthood is kind of the last iteration of this organization. It starts its life in 1921 as the American Birth Control League. And Sanger has for that 3 values. She says, every woman should have the right to choose when and whether to have children. And again, in 1921, this is a fairly progressive, more than progressive. It's a radical idea. The second thing she says is that every child should be wanted and loved. And lastly, that women are entitled to sexual pleasure and fulfillment. And to say that out loud is a very, very radical and uncommon thing in 1921. And that's how she starts that organization. It later becomes the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau and is run by doctors, and it becomes Planned Parenthood in 1942.
Oh, okay. So, this story of how Planned Parenthood was founded is really timely right now because opponents of Planned Parenthood in Congress want to defund this institution, which for some lower income women is their only source of reproductive health care. Now, why do you think Planned Parenthood has such a negative image for some?
Well, I think there's a couple different answers for that. The thing about Planned Parenthood is that when you actually do the research on the organization in the world now, less than 3% of what they do is abortion services, which seems to be the lightning rod for a lot of people in terms of their opposition to it. Most of what they do, overwhelmingly, is healthcare for poor women, preventive healthcare.
Like mammograms.
Mammograms, pap smears, annual exams, STD testing, all of this. So when people come out against Planned Parenthood, what they're really saying is, I'm opposed to comprehensive health care for women, because you can't parse those two things out.
Right.
Planned Parenthood is a healthcare organization. That is what it does. If you're against it, then you are saying, I want men to have health care, I want children to have health care, but I don't want women to have comprehensive health care.
I think you explained that really well, and that's the thing that many women who are against it don't understand. Margaret was a very controversial figure, unsurprisingly, for broaching the subject of birth control and women's pleasure nearly a century ago, and probably most of all because she was a woman and was not supposed to be talking about such things. Would you agree she was pretty brave?
She was definitely someone that possessed an extraordinary amount of personal courage. There's no question. She fought the Comstock laws not only with words and rhetoric, but she fought them with her body in terms of opening a birth control clinic. She puts the Brooklyn district attorney on notice when she does that so that he knows exactly what she's doing, which is breaking the law. She goes to jail repeatedly for breaking the law.
Oh, wow.
She believes the way to be done with these, what she calls these very stupid laws, is to break them. And she does that, and she suffers the consequences.
And attitudes are, for some people, still about the same. Surprisingly, I met a woman at the Women's March who just loved the idea of a women's issues radio talk show, but said, oh, ick, when I mentioned that my first guest was a representative from Planned Parenthood. So there you have it. I mean, why do we have this big division? Why are even many women against health care and reproductive health for women?
I think one of the things that is running in the background that a lot of women don't even realize that they're buying into, because it's so insidious, is that this politicization of birth control and abortion is something that goes back to the 70s and the time of Richard Nixon, when the Republican Party was looking for a way to divide the Democrats' coalition. And one of the things that they recognized was that they could definitely peel off Catholics who had traditionally been Democrats, and they could rally them around this kind of family values agenda. Richard Nixon is the man who signed Title X, which gives the funding for poor women to have health care, including contraception, through places like Planned Parenthood. And yet he is also the one who then, with his strategists, turned this into a strategy to win the White House by carving out Southerners and carving out Catholics and getting them to play on the Republican team because of opposition to abortion specifically. And so for a lot of Catholic women who understandably had misgivings about the existence of abortion, they go to the Republican team and start voting for them, even though they might not otherwise be serving their economic or other interests. But this very emotional issue for them resonates so deeply that they continue to vote Republican and vote against the interests of so many other women who need things like Planned Parenthood. And they probably don't even realize that this is a political strategy.
Right. I'm sure they don't. I'm sure they don't. I understand that Margaret is the person who coined the term birth control, and she was instrumental in the development of the birth control pill. Would you tell us about this innovation that really changed women's lives?
it does change women's lives enormously. One of the questions I often ask in women's history for an essay and a final exam would be, what changes women's lives more, getting the vote or getting the birth control pill? Because it is of that magnitude of change.
Wow.
And in all the years of her activism, Margaret always dreamed of just a simple pill that women could control. They could take it discreetly, and that would be easy and as foolproof as it could be. And so in the 50s, she finally finds a scientist who's Gregory Pincus, who knows he is an expert in reproduction. He's the first person to accomplish the in vitro fertilization of rabbits. And he is the one who discovers the science behind it. And that is how the pill comes about with that partnership.
So, as we've mentioned before, she's always been very controversial. She was involved in eugenics. So I'm wondering if you could first define the term of this term, eugenics, for our listener, and then tell us why this was very controversial.
Right. So eugenics comes from a Greek word, and it more or less means good birth or good origin. It's something that was developed as a science of heredity and good breeding in about the 1880s. And it's presented as this very scientific field, although it's discredited within a few decades. There's two aspects of it. One is positive, where the right kinds of people would reproduce. And then there's negative eugenics, where inferior people are prevented from reproducing. And that is where forced sterilization comes in.
Right.
And there's about 70,000 Americans that are subjected to that in the early 20th century.
I can see why people would be against this.
Right.
Yeah.
California is actually the leader in eugenic sterilizations. So Sanger's work intersects with this because she did advocate birth control as a means of human improvement, which is to say she thought children raised more carefully would have better outcomes. Children that were wanted would have better outcomes. But where she breaks ranks with the eugenicists is that she believes in the power of the environment, that it's not determined by heredity, but that poverty is a prime factor in producing degeneracy and bad outcomes for humans. So she kind of recognizes that there's like an institutional aspect to poverty where eugenicists of the time are more focused on just the genes. If your father is an alcoholic, you will be an alcoholic, and there's sort of no way to get around that. She didn't see the world in that way.
So she wasn't a hardcore eugenicist.
She wasn't. There's overlaps with birth control, and that's where she kind of gets caught up in it, and people get very uncomfortable with that. But when you really kind of go through her writing, you find that it was not a perfect fit at all. It was merely an overlap.
But she was someone who, did innovative things, thought in innovations. So you can see how she would check out a lot of, other information and studies of research going on.
Right, absolutely. She was a woman of her time, interested in a lot of the latest information and science. So this is just one among many things that are circulating in the 20s and 30s.
So from what I read, she was not very diplomatic. She was rather caustic. And did this work well for her?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I guess there's two ways to look at that. On the one hand, the cause that she chooses is inherently controversial. People are really, even now, are really uncomfortable with how to reconcile women's maternity and women's sexuality and women's freedom. And how those two things fit together is still something that Americans are really wrestling with. And so the fact that she's championing this cause makes her inherently controversial. To your specific point, she is also probably not the most diplomatic person on the block. And I'll tell you something I read in the New Yorker magazine. I haven't got a New Yorker online from 1930 that had an article about her. And it said that descriptions of her as timid and conservative were so foreign to her disposition as to be positively funny. And the writer said that she was one of those harmless, meek little women whom wise men are wary of arousing. So she gives the appearance on the surface of this kindly, matronly older woman. Don't poke that dragon. It will get you.
Oh. So do you think women are judged more harshly than men when they appear to be tough?
I think they absolutely are, and I think that's been true for a long time. And women, if you even look at the last presidential election, women have, it's this old thing about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Ginger had to do everything that Fred did backwards and in heels. And so if you look at the last presidential election, you know, if Hillary cried, then she was weak and too emotional and sort of like unreliable in what was the matter with her. And then if she was tough, then she was shrill and off-putting and, bitchy would be the word people would use, and off-putting for that reason. So there's kind of nowhere for women to go. Where is that safe space where we can express power and competence and have it not be dressed down for how we look or sound or, all of these other kind of surface complaints? It's I don't think there's any woman that has mastered it yet, honestly.
Very interesting. Tell us about how she was involved in the medicalization of birth control. We're talking Margaret Sanger here. In other words, how it became part of the doctor's domain. So if you could explain that.
Absolutely. And this is another one of those things that I don't know if Americans appreciate enough, why birth control is in doctors' hands and the role that Sanger had in that, because it's a really important development in a country that has never had socialized medicine where everyone has access to health care. And so what Sanger does in the early 20th century with the American Birth Control League is she has the idea that if you give birth control to doctors and let them prescribe it, it will legitimize it.
Oh.
It's a way to get around these laws and make birth control acceptable. Because instead of a bunch of radical women, you have these nice white male doctors.
Authority figures.
Completely authority. They're trained to be father figures, and they will sort of hold the reins on birth control. And so this is in contrast to a rival organization that existed at the time called the Voluntary Parenthood League, which was run by another woman, Mary Ware Dennett. And the Voluntary Parenthood League's idea is an open bill. Just take these things off the list of obscenities. Let them just be products like any other. But Sanger is dubious of that. She doesn't think that politically that's a viable strategy because it's going to also remove abortion from the list of obscenity. And she doesn't see that as something that Americans are ready for. So having seen in Europe what physician contraception supervision looks like, she can see that here as something that will be palatable and that she can get doctors and the AMA on board with.
Right. So she's probably right on that.
She was right about that. The consequences of that have been enormous for women, especially poor women. But that was her strategy to get around the law.
Okay. Why especially for poor women?
Well, again, in a country without socialized medicine, whether you have access to doctors determines whether you have access to reliable birth control. So for poor women, it has always been a completely different game than what it is for wealthy or middle-class women.
So, the marginalized are the ones who are hurt the most.
Absolutely. The ones who can perhaps least afford the consequences of an unattended pregnancy, they are the ones that end up paying that price.
Wow. So that leads right into my next thought here. President Trump signed an executive order that allows religion to be used as an excuse to deny women coverage for contraceptive and other preventive health care. Now, so employers can refuse insurance to women with their special needs. Now, so that it ends up being a woman is a pre-existing condition.
Right.
Is this because, is the underlying motivation because women's health care costs are greater?
I don't know how much that figures into it. I tend to think it is more the emotional discomfort that Americans seem to have, as I was talking about a little while ago about, reconciling motherhood and sexuality and freedom.
Mm.
And that seems to be the nexus where the difficulty is. And another historian pointed out that when you talk about something like Planned Parenthood, it's two things rolled into one, which is objection to kind of programs for the poor, as well as objection to women's liberation.
And we're going to have to take a little station break right here for an IG. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Colleen Coffey, Associate Professor of History and Women's Studies at Ventura College. And we've been talking about women in history, and we'll be learning about Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Okay, and we're back with Professor Colleen Coffey and more history lessons. Lap it up, ladies. Okay, so we were just talking about President Trump's executive order. How would Margaret Sanger react to this after all this time and women's contraception is still an issue?
I think Sanger would be particularly outraged because it was religion. Her antipathy toward religion, especially the Catholic Church, was something that clearly ran very deep for her and is very well documented. There's an interview with her from the 1960s. I think it's with Mike Wallace. And he asks her at one point, what is the principal source of opposition to the birth control pill? And she doesn't even let him finish the sentence before she sort of comes out of her chair and she says it's the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And he says, well, surely you can't take exception to the hierarchy of the church. And she cuts him right off and said, oh, I most certainly do. They don't know love. They don't know marriage. They don't know what it takes to bring up children. And I think she would say something similar about our administration's motives today. They don't really have a sense, certainly Mr. Trump, as an extraordinarily wealthy man who, by his own admission, has never changed a diaper or pushed a carriage with a baby in it. He has no idea what it is like to be a mother or to raise children, what is involved in that. His daughter, for all her well-meaning activism, also is probably very unacquainted with the realities for working women, especially low-income working women. So when they get cavalier about health care and birth control, it's very easy for them to do because they don't have to be up close to the consequences of that mean-spiritedness toward others.
And this fight to have birth control readily available has now gone to insurance, so that employers have the right to refuse birth control coverage to women on the employer's religious grounds, not on the woman's. So he's really, or she is making a decision for these women. Why is this discrimination?
Well, it's definitely discrimination, and the thing about it is, if you sort of substitute in any other kind of health care except for women's birth control, this becomes an outrageous proposition for Americans. So if you said, oh, well, employers' insurance, I'm a Christian Scientist, I don't believe in vaccines. So my employees won't have access to any, regularly scheduled vaccines under their health program. This would be a complete outrage. It would never be allowed to stand. And yet, when you look at a decision like Hobby Lobby and you kind of think through the long-term logic of that, you could get to a place where an employer could say, well, my religion says, you can't have thus and so. Why, I'm aware just recently in Idaho, there's been a big story because faith healing is allowed by law in Idaho. So parents are not made to take their children to doctors. And they have documented almost 200 cases of children dying who could have been cured by available medicine, but their parents elected prayer instead, and the children died. And so when the law allows these things, when it comes to birth control, it can become a very slippery slope, the kind of law of unintended consequences.
Right.
Sure, it's just birth control now, but you've opened the door to that. And what else could potentially be trotted out?
Right. And all because we don't have a generalized health system, uniform for all.
There's that, and it also comes to something we were talking about before we started today, which was the separation of church and state.
Uh-huh.
Church and state should stay 50 yards apart at all times. And we're starting to see, not starting, it's always been there, but this real melding around this issue of birth control where church and state is getting quite muddled.
Right. So from an historical standpoint, what is at play here? Why do women have to fight again and again for their right of choice on whether they want or are even capable of having another child?
I think there's a very complicated answers to that question, but I'll give you two kind of simple ones.
Okay.
To be straightforward. One, as we talked about a moment ago, this issue has been really effective at dividing the Democratic Party in the 20th century. And we still have never sort of seen that party really find its footing again in the same way that it had early in the 20th century, largely because several constituencies of the Democrats have been kind of cherry-picked away to the Republicans based on these kind of moral, religious issues. The second thing is the politics of abortion and contraception are really good at keeping women divided.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's something, again, that I think sometimes women don't realize that, maybe it sounds too stereotyped, but it's almost like you're sort of pawns in a larger game that you may not realize you're playing. And that when you look at women who, like you were talking about the Women's March, who, ooh, yuck, Planned Parenthood, and they get kind of off-put by these things, which is really just healthcare for women. As long as women stay divided and distracted, think of how much women time is devoted to fighting for birth control, for abortion rights, for self-determination is what they're fighting for. And while we're all busying ourselves with those issues, we're not dealing with the fact that we are completely underrepresented in government.
Right. We could be running for office.
Right. We could be running for office, or that women are barely represented on the boards of all the biggest media companies, which control all the messaging, all the advertising, all the filmmaking, the TV. We're not dealing with any of that. There is one analysis that says at the rate we're going, it will take women 500 years to achieve parity in government in America.
Oh, my gosh.
So while we're all still arguing about whether or not poor women should have a pap smear so they don't die of cancer, that's what we're not dealing with.
Wow. So do you think some of the controversy about back to Margaret Sanger was created by the same misogynistic attitudes toward any woman in a position of real power?
I think that is absolutely true. That misogyny runs deep, and if you need to remind yourself of how present it is, all you need to do is read newspaper and reporting about women who attempt to seize some kind of power, whether they run for office or run a company. Just read the reporting about them. And one example that comes to mind recently is about Nancy Pelosi and her 8-hour speech in stiletto heels. You remember this?
Yes, I saw that, yeah.
And so little was written about the content of that record-breaking speech. And the commentary is about how old is she? Should she be wearing those heels? Why are we talking about this?
Well, exactly.
Why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about Hillary's hairdo, or that whatever she wore at such and such an event, or if so-and-so had a facelift? It is a way of just taking women down. And what does that really model for young women? Oh, you want to be in power? Well, listen, honey, here's what you have to look forward to. And every woman that attempts a step up gets taken down in a way that is just so depressing and demoralizing.
Right.
And the older you get, the more vulnerable you are to those kinds of attacks.
Right. And back to the stilettos. I really love that. Yeah, that's such a loaded word. It gives, Nancy Pelosi, who is a marvelous woman and does really good work. All her male colleagues say that. It gives her kind of a flighty, unbalanced, incompetent, only care about her looks.
Right. It gives the impression of only caring about looks. And Nancy herself said in an interview a few years back that when she was first running for office, so many questions were directed to her about who would be taking care of her children. And she said, at the time I ran for my first office, my youngest child was a senior in high school. And yet all these questions about who would take care of her children.
And we're going to have to leave it right there. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room.